Welcome to the Evolving Spiritual Practice podcast. My name is Ralph Cree. This is brought to you in association with bodyheartmindspirit.co.uk. Today I spoke with Roger Walsh and had a very interesting conversation with him about the journey he's had with practice in his life, spiritual practices, meditation, psychotherapy, those kind of things. He's in his late 70s. He's been very much in the scene of transpersonal psychology and meditation since the 70s, writing lots of interesting books and doing great teaching from his university and meeting all the the who's who of the world of spirituality in his life. And there's a lot of wisdom to share. So this was a conversation, kind of like a campfire chat with an elder in the world of spirituality and spiritual practice, and him sharing his wisdom about the path of practice. And I just read a little bit from his bio on his website. So Roger graduated from Australia's Queensland University with degrees in psychology, physiology, neuroscience and medicine, and then came to the United States as a Fulbright Scholar. He's now at the University of California, Irvine, where he is Professor of Psychiatry, Philosophy and Anthropology, as well as a Professor in the Religious Studies program. Roger's research and writings span several areas. These include the nature of psychological health and well-being, meditation and contemplative practices, religion and spirituality, wisdom and other virtues, integral studies and the psychological roots of our current global crises. He is deeply immersed in contemplative practices as a student, researcher and teacher. Roger's books include Paths Beyond Ego, Meditation, Classic and Contemporary Perspectives, Essential Spirituality, the 7 Central Practices with a foreword by the Dalai Lama, and The World of Shamanism. He's currently editing The World's Great Wisdom, What Sages Say About Living Wisely and Well. He's collected lots and lots of awards for his writing, international ones and national ones, and teaching of different types. And in his other lives, Roger was formerly a circus acrobat, as well as a record holder in high diving and trampolining. Recently, he graduated from the San Francisco Comedy College and tried his hand rather unsuccessfully at stand-up comedy. He was married to the psychologist Frances Vaughan, who died in 2017, and together they co-authored several books. So I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. I thought it was really interesting. And if you are someone who is into spiritual practices at any stage along the way, I think there is wisdom here for you to pick up on how to skillfully navigate the journey. Thank you. So Roger Walsh, welcome to the Evolving Spiritual Practice podcast.
Thanks so much, Rob.
Yeah, very nice to have you here. And I will have done an intro where I go through your bio. There's a good one on your website which I'll be using. And so just what I'd like to discuss with you, what I had in mind was. I've been known about your work for about 15, really 20 years, and know that you've practiced different meditation traditions, for example, and written books on shamanism and worked in the transpersonal psychology field for many decades. And am I right in thinking you're 77 now?
Yep.
You are?
Yes, just correct that.
Yeah. And I'm 45. So I kind of see ourselves, perhaps I'm midway through my practice journey if I get to live a full life. And then you're an elder in this field, having done many decades of it. And what I'd love to do with you is to have a kind of like a campfire chat, with just an informal chat about your journey of practice and how that's changed over the years, and the types of advice you would give to people perhaps at the starting out at the beginning of their practice, and then in the also kind of halfway through, and if there are different types of advice you give to people at different stages. And it's kind of like passing down the wisdom through the intergenerational wisdom here. So that was the thing I'd love to do with you today.
Well, maybe so.
Yeah, great. So I thought, given that I would have done a short bio of you beforehand, but I wondered if you could give perhaps a short history of your practice. When it began, and the types of lineages you've practiced in, and particular types of practice. I mean, I know it's a very difficult question, because I know that you have done a lot of things in your life, including being a circus acrobat. So, to narrow it down seems a little artificial, but I hope you can get the gist of what I'm asking.
Oh, well, you're essentially asking about the evolution of my contemplative practices, and I should preface by saying that I'm the last person I would ever expect to have been doing contemplative practices, because I was trained as a physician and a neuroscientist. I was a hardcore scientist, more than that, as a scientismist, that is, one who thinks that science is the only way of acquiring valid information. And after my medical training, I had the good fortune of getting a Fulbright Scholarship to come to California to continue my training and specialty training in psychiatry at Stanford. And California has a way of changing people. I arrived in the late 70s and found people talking about getting in touch with feelings and other weird things. And I was very much out of my depth and out of my culture, including even in psychiatry, because I really had no experience of the inner world. And so I began doing psychotherapy on people, even though I had, in retrospect, I don't think I probably should have, but I figured I had a moral obligation to try it for myself. So I went into psychotherapy for myself, expecting a few interesting weeks, and had the extreme good fortune of ending up with an extraordinarily skilled master therapist by the name of Jim Bugental, who trained me to become aware of the inner world, to be able to access the realm of thoughts and feelings and fantasies and images and background affect that constitute our inner world. And it just blew me out of the water, because I discovered there was an inner universe as vast and mysterious as the outer, that I'd been completely out of touch with, completely unaware of. And I felt like I'd been living my life on the top 6 inches of a wave on top of an ocean that I didn't even know existed. And it just was mind-boggling to me, especially because as I looked around at the culture, it seemed like 90+% of the culture was also out of touch with this inner world, and that our Western culture was extremely outwardly oriented with almost no awareness of the inner depths within us. But fortunately, in California, there were lots of things happening at that time. The whole human potential movement was burgeoning. And so I dove into that, and you name it, I did it. TA, TM, Esterica, Gestalt, you name it, I tried it. And for a period of, I think there was 1 year where there were only a couple of weekends when I wasn't in a workshop of some kind or another. So I was really diving very deeply into a whole array of psychological, therapeutic, human potential movement isms of one kind or another, some of which was very nonsensical, some of which was extremely valuable. And gradually I found myself moving towards things like meditation, chanting, and yoga, which really mystified me, because I knew that religions were the opiate of the masses and relics of primitive thinking. And why was I doing these practices from them and finding them beneficial? And it really puzzled me. I literally spent a couple of years just wrestling with the question of how could what I understood to be religion, these primitive, mythical, magical systems, have some technologies which seem to be effective. And there was literally one moment as I was walking across the living room floor that I realized that behind the conventional institutions with their rituals and myths and dogmas were little recognized psycho-spiritual technologies for training the mind to induce the same states of consciousness that the founders had realized, and to enable all of us to have the same kinds of insights and recognitions and realizations and even awakenings that the founders had had. And it just changed my life. And I dove into meditation, and the day after I got tenure at the university, I applied for 2 years of leave of absence to go to Asia and disappear into a monastery. And so it became an ongoing exploration.
Where was that? The monastery you ended up? What country?
Well, I didn't spend 2 years, but I did spend a couple of months in Burma. In my first major I experimented with a variety of meditation practices, but the one I gravitated towards was the Buddhist insight or Vipassana practice. And at that time, the great aspiration was to go to Asia. It was very important to get one's BA, been to Asia. So I went to Burma and got my BA. And I would say the main thing I learned was everything they say is true. You don't have to leave home to get it. Some of the teachers there some of them had very deep awakenings, but they were not particularly skilled teachers. And what I realized was that realization or awakening and teaching skill are two different capacities. And that's recognized in Buddhism. There's prajna, which is insight, wisdom, and there's upaya, which is skill in means or practical wisdom. We find the same division in Western philosophy between Sophia, profound insight, and phronesis, practical wisdom. So that's recognized in Buddhism and the West. And I just found it for myself. So I came back, very grateful to have had that experience, but not particularly helped. And then I began exploring the full array of practices that were available, and kind of, again, California is a unique laboratory in our time. If Ken Wilber and I once had a conversation of when was there last a time, like, say, San Francisco, where you could find all the world's contemplative practices and religions. And the best we could come up with was Alexandria 2,000 years ago.
Right.
So I was a beneficiary of this meeting place of world spirituality and contemplative practices. And I just explored as many as I possibly could. My late wife, Frances Vaughan, called me spiritually promiscuous, but it was a kind of promiscuity she could handle. So that was okay. So I feel very fortunate to be an heir to multiple psychological strains of wisdom and practice, and multiple contemplative kinds.
What? Well, there's a couple of things that came up for me when you were talking there. The thing about the teacher versus the great practitioner. I like thinking of tennis, that you've got the great tennis players wouldn't necessarily be great coaches. So the people that coach Djokovic and tennis players like that can't play tennis like Djokovic can, but they are great at facilitating it, bringing out Djokovic's great tennis. I was a drum teacher for a long time and taught many people the drums, and there were plenty of drummers who were way better than me. In fact, I even had students that got better than me. But I think I was quite a good teacher, given the feedback I got from the students and parents of students and things I had, and that's how I saw myself. I wasn't there to show off how good I was at drumming or anything like that. It was bringing that out of the students, and it's a great. I think that's one of the kind of classic errors I've made on the path, particularly idealizing authors or teachers who weren't necessarily great teachers. They might have been realized people who were very proficient in meditation practice, for example, and we kind of conflate those things. And so if I take, for example, Namkai Norbu was a great Dzogchen master and wrote these amazing books on Dzogchen, and I think explored consciousness in ways that were very, very unusual. You know, not many people will be as good at dream yoga as Namkai Norbu, for example, in the world. And he was a great teacher. But then I went to see him teach a few years ago, and afterwards I found this documentary that his son had made about what Namkai Norbu was like as a father, and he was a really awful father. Basically, it came across as, and it was this was later on in my life when I've kind of idealized teachers a bit less, but there was a time where I thought someone who could write a book like Namkai Norbu does, or expound on Dzogchen teachings like he did, must be amazing at everything, and so that was one thing, and I don't know whether you had something else to add to that.
Yeah, what you're speaking about, Ralph, is what's often called the halo effect. We have the presumption that if someone is outstanding in a particular area, they will necessarily be outstanding in all areas, and it just isn't so. We all have very specific talents and capacities, and they may be either gifted or they may be highly trained. But in general, one of the things we know from psychological research now is that skill in one arena does not necessarily generalize to other skills. And in fact, it looks like, unfortunately, that cognitive trainings in a specific cognitive capacity, such as memorization or concentration, etc., don't necessarily confer extraordinary capacities in other realms. They may be of enormous benefit and have overlap and facilitate the development of them, but we need to be very aware of our tendency to idealize and put a halo effect on people. And it's also really important to realize there are just us human beings. There's this myth of the, quotes, perfect teacher. Well, that is a deadly, or can be a deadly trap. There are only human beings who teach. There aren't any perfect human beings. I've had the incredible good fortune of researching and writing and going around the world looking for human exemplars. Who are some of the wisest, most mature, most awake people on the planet? And I can tell you, there are some people with amazing gifts and capacities, and they're all human. They all have limitations. It's just our nature. That's the way we are.
I think the religious hagiographies that are so common in say I was very into Tibetan Buddhism for a long time, and I'd read about these kind of biographies of ancient yogis, and the thing is that they were writing about someone who lived, say, 1,000 years ago, and nobody living has ever met this person, and they don't know what they were like behind the scenes and all this, and this idea, you get this idealized version, and you sort of, I think it's so easy to just become like an infant. Spirituality does something funny to people, myself included, that we tend to think that the normal rules don't apply there. Like you can have complete common sense in your business and your family relationships and things, and then once you get involved in spirituality, so we just lose our heads, and you know what I mean?
I would partly agree, Ralph, but I would want a nuance. I don't think it's inevitable, but it's certainly, you're certainly pointing to a trap that
Right.
we all
Yeah.
need to be aware of. And
Yeah.
you're pointing to the tendency to idealization. Yeah, I mean, there's so many stories of so-and-so heard the teachings, went into the forest, meditated, got enlightened. Well, yeah, that's kind of like boy meets girl, right off to the sunset, live happily ever after. If you've ever been in a romantic relationship, you know something is missing from that story.
Yeah.
And same thing. And there's a bit of an adage in Tibetan Buddhism: you should always pick a teacher who's at least 2 valleys away from you, meaning you've got a day's hiking or so to reach them, because then you don't see their foibles as much.
Right.
And you can,
Yeah.
and within the practice of Guru Yoga, in which one specifically uses one's teacher and visualizes them in an idealized form, and if you're doing it correctly, you recognize that that idealized form is a projection of your own unacknowledged capacities and realization. It's not that they're ideal, it's that you visualize them in an idealized form, but what you are visualizing is an image or projection of your own as yet unacknowledged capacities and realization. So that Guru Yoga, when done in a very skillful way, makes use of our tendency to idealize. But hopefully, and it's not always so, but hopefully it's also done with a wise context of recognizing what the goal is and how it's best held.
So I could hear a little bit of advice coming through there, that you were saying it doesn't have to be that way, that we don't have to idealize the teachers and in a kind of infantilized way. And some things that have been useful for me, I got very into Sam Harris's work for a long time, and that kind of taught me how to be a bit think critically about spirituality. I, for the last few years, been listening to a podcast called Conspirituality, which is kind of very critical about the spiritual scene and teachers, and talks about scandals and things. I think learning about specific examples of scandals with teachers and communities and those kind of things can help you understand the actual living world of all of this, compared with the ancient hagiographies we teach. I mean, what other advice would you add to that in terms of people getting straighter discernment over this issue? It seems to be, it comes up a lot. I mean, I listen to a lot of podcasts, and you know, in the contemporary spiritual scene, the problem of teachers and gurus, and it's just, I mean, it's an evergreen topic, but it seems to be very much part of that. We're still grappling with this issue, and yeah, what would you add to that in terms of things we can do to actually get some clarity on the issue?
Well, you're pointing to something important, Ralph, and that is that this tendency to look for and idealize an other is an innate part of psychological nature, or at least an innate part of our nature, as long as we identify with our separate self-sense, our egoic self-sense, and that can take that idealization can take many forms. It can be political idealization of a political movement, a political leader. It can be a spiritual figure, but that tendency to idealization is particularly problematic exactly when it goes along with the dynamic that you mentioned, which is the tendency to infantilize and devalue ourselves. And so that is particularly tricky. And basically, what you're asking is a subset of a larger question. That is, there are multiple traps in life and in contemplative and spiritual practice. And the larger question is, how do we most effectively, or at least somewhat effectively, guard ourselves against the many traps that await us? And how do we, once we fall in, how do we extricate ourselves most skillfully? So you're actually asking or pointing to a large and very, very important question.
Well, are you able to describe a trap that you fell into and how you got out of it? Or is that too personal?
Well, we've only got an hour here, Ralph. So, I mean, there are lots of traps. I also went through my idealization phase, and fortunately had the good fortune of being with very good people and teachers, and who did not in any way cultivate or that idealization in a narcissistic way, nor did they take advantage of it at all. So I was very fortunate in that. Let's see, I think, gosh, I'll just name a couple that came. I was extremely out of balance in my practice. I've been an overachiever through my life, and I brought that overachieving style to my practice. So I worked very hard at contemplative practice. I did, for example, a series of 3-month retreats in which, following the kind of ascetic advice of the monastic Theravadan Buddhist tradition, I cut my sleep down to 4 hours a night. I meditated continuously from the moment I got up to the moment I fell asleep. It was enlightenment or bust, and I busted. I totally burned out. And it took me a couple of years or more to really recover from the severe burnout that I experienced. I efforted until I literally could not effort anymore. And fortunately, one of the advantages of spiritual practice, contemplative practice, growth practices of any kind, is that ideally they are self-reflective and they enable us to bring greater awareness to our experience. So the eventual positive side of that, or learning from that, was I was so invested in effort and achievement that it took burning out for me to be able to let it go. And I reached a point where it was so painful to make the slightest mental effort to concentrate or focus that I just had to let go. And that's what got me into Zen. And Zen's central practice is shikantaza. And the only instruction in Zen is just sit. Should I focus on the breath? Just sit. Should I concentrate? Just sit. Should I, the instructions are designed to undercut all the mental strivings and goals and attempts to be anything other than one already is in this very moment. And it literally took that for me to be able to see that my striving was was based on a belief that the present moment is unsatisfactory, inadequate, and that what was required was to reach a future better moment. And that is the goal and the belief with which most of us enter contemplative, into psychotherapy, and into spiritual practice. The belief that I got to get better. And yes, it's extremely valuable to improve ourselves in various ways, to purify, that is, to reduce destructive emotions such as anger and greed, anger and hatred, and motives such as greed and aversion. And it is also just as important to come to a full acceptance and welcoming of oneself just as one is. And in fact, there is a point on spiritual practice where one realizes that the goal is not to perfect oneself, but to accept oneself. And that is a 180-degree turn and is absolutely crucial. And wise people people with wise teachers will get that sooner than I did.
Yeah, and I think, as you were saying, it took your burnout to get from that kind of more yang orientation into it kind of chucks you into a yin thing in a way, if you could describe it that way, or that. And then as one gets older, you, like a wine or a whiskey, the flavor improves with age, and but that you can't rush that process. And when I think when I was just starting out with all of this stuff, a very much kind of heroic effort and storming the gates of heaven approach, and in a way we'd like to not have started, to help people perhaps not start that way, but perhaps we all have to start that way, or do you know what I mean? You can't suddenly get to wisdom, or you can't suddenly get to a mature wine, and I find it a little bit hard to express this, but do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think you're saying we bring our personalities to our practice.
Well, there you go. We're not all the same. Yeah. But so if you could meet someone, and as perhaps, that, yeah, that a certain, there we go. And then that's a great point, that there are types of personalities.
And some people,
yeah.
I brought an achieving, striving, goal-oriented personality to this. Someone else might be very lazy and slobbish and not practice enough.
Yeah.
So, and balance is, I'm now about to quote one of the first pieces of really great advice I got on the path, and that was the first retreat I did with Ram Dass. And he said, balance is a magic word on the spiritual path. And it's like, I've been thinking about that for 40 years, and boy, did he get that right.
Yeah.
Balance. Where am I off balance? And the Buddha used a similar metaphor. He said, a musician came to him asking about effort. He said, well, how do you tighten the strings of your instrument? What you want to do it is not too tight, not too loose. And that was his metaphor for balance.
Yeah, with that, and so we're kind of trying to get to this balance or harmony, and we might get to that from one side or the other. And I suppose a skilled teacher or community would recognize the different types of personalities and recommend different types of practice or different intensities based on who they are. But there's this kind of, with the more traditional practices, as they've come down, you end up with this the one true way, the one practice, the one path to do, and this is the best one, and everyone should do this. And I think there's a kind of more nuanced postmodern take on this now, which has a more nuanced understanding of different psychological profiles that we could bring to bear on that.
Yeah, you're pointing to several important things there, Ralph. And one is that the kind of practice and kind of advice that is ideally individualized. And Jack Cornfield, probably one of the best known meditation teachers in the world, gives a wonderful story of his own teacher, Ajahn Chah, in Thailand. And Jack would sit and listen to Ajahn Chah's advice to various people as they came to him. Jack is not a shy character, and finally he said to Ajahn Chah, "You're just so inconsistent. You tell one person to do this and another person to do that." And Ajahn Chah said, "Well, I'm kind of like someone who's been walked down a long road. And I see someone else beginning to walk down, and I see they're about to fall in a ditch on the right. And I say, go left, go left. Another person's about to fall into a ditch on the left. I say, go right, go right." Yeah, it's just, what do they need?
Well, related to that, something that comes through very strongly in the traditions that have their origins in India is being aware during waking, dreaming, and deep sleep. As a result of many years of meditation practice, and some of the traditions that have their roots in India kind of suggests that that is like a litmus test for what they are referring to as enlightenment, or realization, or however they might phrase it. And it's a question I've asked a few people who are advanced in years, who've done a lot of this practice, and some have said, well, actually, well, that's a red herring, or that's leaning too far into transcendence, and you might become really proficient in all of that, but end up with no heart. So, what would you say? I mean, I know you would have come across this being into Buddhism and of different types and the Indian religions, and I don't know what your own experience has been with these 3-month-long meditation retreats, and what
Well,
you
let me just begin by
feeling.
saying I am absolutely hopeless at sleep yoga, so I don't like that criterion at all.
Yeah.
But I think you're touching on larger questions here, Ralph. And one first off, you said the continuity of awareness 24 hours a day is a test of enlightenment. Well, first off, I would like to do away with the term enlightenment. Death to enlightenment, as far as I'm concerned, it is a lousy category. It is unidimensional. It only talks about one dimension of growth. It is dichotomous. You either got it or you haven't. It's from one tradition, yet applied across traditions. And it just misses so much and so many nuances. And I would much prefer to do away with the term and replace it with spiritual maturity. Spiritual maturity is open to multiple dimensions of growth. It's open to the recognition that growth can occur in varying degrees. Ken Wilber gave a nice example, when someone asked about, well, are you enlightened? He said, well, are you educated? Well, somewhat. Are you fully educated? No. Could you be more? Of course. Are you awake? Well, I have some continuity a little bit of the time. Are you? It's an invalid. I think it's a very problematic category. So that would be my first salvo in response to your question. Second, is continuous awareness a test of something? Well, it's a great test of continuous awareness. Does it say, but then the question is, to what extent does continuity of awareness bleed out into or facilitate or is correlated with other beneficent qualities of heart and mind, other capacities? And you mentioned that some of your guests have said, no, that's a red herring. Well, I don't think it's necessarily a red herring, but there is a problem when we make any one capacity the criterion of a spiritual life. We are multidimensional, complex, multifaceted creatures. And anytime we focus on one capacity, there is a problem. This is part of a more general issue called the Goodhart's Law. And Goodhart's Law says when you make any measure the criterion, you inevitably end up in problems. So we have made quotes enlightenment this mythical accomplishment, which most people have. When you ask, well, what do you mean by that? They have almost no idea, but it is inherently problematic. Now, as to continuous awareness, is this a valuable capacity? Absolutely. There's all psychotherapies, whether they recognize it or not, and a lot of contemplative practices have as a central capacity they are cultivating greater awareness, whether they call it self-reflection in psychotherapy, or mindfulness in Theravadan Buddhism, or awareness in Rigpa and Dzogchen, etc., etc. If you look, Shiva, and etc. We can come up with a long list of names. But going back to, since you started in Buddhism, back to classical Buddhism, one of the three capacities or gifts that mindfulness confers is it inhibits the arising of problematic mind states. It fosters the arising of positive mind states and qualities like love and compassion. And it balances them. Again, the magic word balance. So is this continuous awareness valuable? Absolutely. Is it helpful to think of it as a sole criterion? I would say Goodhart's law applies here. It is very problematic. Now, are there benefits that are unique to the capacity to, say, maintain continuity of awareness through the night in sleep? Absolutely. There are the whole realm of what are called sleep yogas. And I would strongly recommend, if you haven't, that you have as a guest Andrew Holacek, who is an absolute master of these skills.
I have sent him an invitation, but I haven't heard back yet.
Wonderful.
I know his work. He's actually got a really good podcast I listen to.
He does.
Yeah.
He does. And maybe your guests would be interested in my own podcast, Deep Transformation, Self-Society, Spirit, because we did a 3-hour dialogue with Andrew on dream yoga, and he is superb, absolutely.
It was
superb.
a very, very good conversation you had with him. I've recommended that to some people.
Maybe I'll just complete by telling a story from by the Dalai Lama at the National Transpersonal Association meeting. He gave a talk and said, I'd like to tell you about our dream yoga. And he said, first of all, we teach our yogis to be aware when they're dreaming. I thought, oh yeah, lucid dreaming, no big deal. And then he said, and then we teach them to be aware between their dreams. So then now they can watch themselves falling asleep. They can watch a dream arise. They can watch themselves going back into dream asleep, watch themselves waking up. So all right, I'm out of my league, I can see. And then we teach them to be aware that the waking state is also a dream. So now they're continuously aware 24 hours a day that they are living in a dream. And he said, once you can do that, it's not so hard to watch yourself as you die and are reborn. Well, at this stage, I just had to, sit there with my jaw hanging because, is it true? I have no idea. I have no idea how one could even test him. He's supposedly done it 14 times. So at the very least, what we do know is that there are a variety of practices one can do while asleep. One can do so-called dream yoga and non-dream yoga. One can actually do practices both in the dreams and between dreams, and that these can be extremely valuable, and that the mind in this stage is extremely subtle and malleable, and therefore, according to the masters of these practices, transformation can occur in some cases quite rapidly. So again, to summarize, is this continuous awareness wonderful? Is it something to practice if one has the gifts to do so? Great. Is it something to get attached to? Absolutely not. I did. I tried it. What I ended up with was insomnia, not lucid dreaming. So, and again, is it a criterion of enlightenment? Well, I don't even, I would toss enlightenment to begin with. Is it a sole criterion? No. So that would be my very long, convoluted answer to your question.
Yeah, I actually, after listening to your conversation with Andrew, he was saying one of the first things you do in dream yoga is try and transform objects in your dreams into other things. And I had a lucid dream after that, and I tried to change a pizza into a basketball, and I made the pizza vanish, but I couldn't make a basketball appear, and I didn't quite know how to do it. It's a bit like, when there's like a Harry Potter movie or something where they trying to learn some magic trick, and it's, well, how do you actually, and I was just sort of standing there just like willing this transformation to happen. But anyway, someone needs to look more into. Well, one of the things I wanted to ask you about is So, read your book, Sensual Spirituality, a long time ago. I believe that's the title. Have I got it right?
Yes, essential spirituality, the seven central practices. It's basically a distillation of the practices that one finds across different traditions.
Oh, I've just remembered what I was going to say. While I was looking gormless, while I was thinking of that. Um, I'll get to that in a second. But idealism. So you was, and this relates to the sort of what you were saying about the Tibetan yogis and the dreaming and awaking dream and things. That you said you started off a, a very hardcore scientist, and I'm assuming a kind of with a materialist worldview and that. And has that changed? I mean, I imagine it has, but how has that changed in your life? When I think about my own life, I kind of started out very much a materialist, and there's been a kind of gradual move over the years towards an idealist view. I mean, I'd have to say, ultimately, I have not got a damn idea what is going on. I can't make any final statement about anything and feel confident with it. But I
I congratulate you.
thanks. um, I was recently listening to an interview with Dennis McKenna, and he said he's drunk ayahuasca 500 times roughly. And they said, "Well, what?" And the interviewer said, "What have you learned after that 500 times of drinking ayahuasca?" And he said, "Not a damn thing," which I thought was quite an interesting comment. And
Of
um,
course, it'd be interesting to know exactly what he means by that. That sounds like a flippant response,
oh, it
which,
is. Oh, it
you know,
is. Yeah, it is. But it was so spot on. I mean, yeah, as someone who's drunk ayahuasca a few times, I know what that experience is like, and I understand the kind of the joke there. But um, I've been very influenced by the work of Bernardo Kastrup and sort of idealist philosophy, um, which putting just for those listening, that puts consciousness as a kind of um, the essence of everything being consciousness rather than material. And I've found that a lot of the religious traditions made a bit more sense looked through an idealist lens. And I presume a lot of the worldviews where these religions were created um, were idealist. It was an idealist worldview, sort of pre-materialist, pre-industrial worldview. But um, so where do you stand with all this idealism and materialism and all of that stuff, and how's that changed over your life?
well, I stand with you. I don't know, but giving a more a fuller response, yes, you're right. I started as a hardcore materialist, a scientismist, uh, and I, as such, dismissed all contemplative practices and spirituality, etc. It was a long, hard, fingers dragging in the dirt transformation for me to let go my materialistic metaphysics and to move towards a more idealist one. That is, let me provide a context. Like you, my fundamental context is agnostic. And the assumption that we live in mystery, boundless, bottomless mystery, and that there's a wonderful statement by let's see, who was one of the early quantum physicists, I think. I'm not pulling up his name, but he said every statement of mine is a question, and that's the way I feel. So I can give various statements about my suppositions, but they're only suppositions. At bottom, I assume that I and all of us live in mystery. The great religious scholar Houston Smith wrote his autobiography, published it on his 90th birthday, which is a great time to publish an autobiography. And the last words in his book are, "We are born in mystery, we live in mystery, and we die in mystery." And that was one of the wisest people I've ever met. And I thought, great summary. So that I take that as my fundamental presupposition. We live in mystery, and we have to make best guesses about the way things are. In this case, we're very like Pyrrhonism, the ancient Greek philosophy founded by Pyrrho, who was a Greek who walked to India with Alexander's the Great's army, met there the gymnosophists, the Hindu yogis, and subsequently adopted a philosophy very similar to what became Mahayana Buddhist, Madhyamaka philosophy of that one cannot make definitive statements about the fundamental nature of reality. So, I'm somewhat echoing Pyrrhonism here, but like you, I now assume as my working hypothesis that consciousness is primary, so that's a kind of idealism, and that all phenomena are an expressions, projection, manifestation of consciousness, and that this to most people in our materialistic culture seems nonsensical. How could the mind create everything? Well, very easily answered. Very easily pointed to by remembering that every night we create worlds and people and bodies and selves and take them to be entirely solid, physical, real entities. And it's only if we awaken in the dream, that is, if our dream becomes lucid, or when we awaken from the dream, that we recognize, oh, they were just mind projections. And one of the claims of the world's contemplative traditions is, well, we haven't yet awoken from our waking state and haven't yet recognized that this too is a dreamlike reality. But that is a potential, and that is the potential that the world's contemplative traditions point us to. And the practices they offer to train the mind are the ones which allow us to penetrate through the dream, to recognize its nature, and to recognize our underlying true nature or reality, which is far more vast and mysterious than we ever imagined. We're not only more than we think, we're more than we can think. And that is the goal of the great contemplative traditions.
And that brings up a word that's become much more important over the years in my own life is trust. That to be able to trust, sort of initially, the mystery is a terrifying thing in one's life, and part of the way I see a lot of these practices is, you have enough experiences that are a bit beyond your normal conscious states, that you kind of gain a trust for what all the things that we are, and all the so if I use myself as an example, I probably done about 150 psychedelic experiences in my life, high dose ones, and after a certain time, you have experienced so much of those worlds that we kind of develop a trust for who. Because I've encountered capacities in myself in those states, I have a trust for my own nature and who I am, but also what the nature of the cosmos is, and not that I understand. And I think the trust or faith is not necessarily related to understanding what it's all about. So yeah, I think I just wanted to bring that up as something I think is something that I think probably develops, and I'm imagining it develops more and more in one's life, hopefully, this trust, because I think initially it's terrifying, the unknown, and I suppose that's what gets us into spiritual practices, because we're trying to learn how to surf on the ocean of the unknown, perhaps. And anyway, there's my word dump.
Well, it's a good one. And thank you for being such an intrepid explorer and coming to your own conclusions about this, and your conclusion that yes, we can trust at a very fundamental level. And so maybe a context for a discussion on this between us would be to acknowledge that there are levels of trust or faith. We think of faith as a blind belief, but we cannot live without faith of some kind, trust of some kind. We have faith that gravity will hold, that if we step off this cliff we'll die, etc., etc. So we can't live without faith, but there are developmental levels of faith, and the researcher James Fowler actually came up with 6 major levels, and for they're particularly relevant to contemplative life, in as much as we, early faith levels, for example, magic, mythic, or mythic conventional, where we basically accept the world, the culture's conventions and myths as real, as given, as true. Then we move to the individuative reflective stage, where we step back and begin to look at them. Well, is it really true that my country is the best, and that a man's place is, and a woman's place, et cetera, et cetera? But there are stages, that's about where most people are in, but there are stages beyond that, an integrative stage and even a unitive stage of faith, grounded on experience of oneness with the cosmos, the Tao, God, whatever. So let's first acknowledge that there are different stages of faith. And what most people mean by faith is blind faith. Just, I'm going to, I believe this, don't bother me with facts. But what you are describing is a trust that developed out of testing and experience for yourself, what Buddhism would call tested trust, tested faith. And it's very important. And it is true that the major growth jumps are stepping into the unknown. And that is initially very scary. And at its most extreme, it takes the form of a death experience. One literally dies to one's own way of understanding oneself and the universe. And it can literally be experienced as a death experience. And that goes back to thousands of years of shamanism, to psychedelic experiences, even to depth psychotherapy. But the good news is that the death experience is usually followed by a rebirth, so that the archetypal death rebirth experience is the dying to an outdated worldview and self-sense, and the birth into ideally a more expanded, integrated, holistic, encompassing, and healthy worldview. Now, we were given some wonderful advice on this by one of the great sages of history. Jesus, 2,000 years ago, said, "The truth will set you free." I have come to think that's one of the most compact pieces of wisdom that ever hit the planet. The truth will set you free. And most of us have the assumption that the truth is inevitably scary. That if we open to the truth of who we are and the way things are, we'll be terrified or even overwhelmed, maybe even become psychotic. And that's a very deep-seated belief for most people, which we don't really recognize until we do deep inner work. But it is a terribly constricting, limiting belief, and very destructive one. But what we find is that when we open to experience, when we keep opening, we find that, first of all, we can trust ourselves and we can trust our minds. And we find that if given the right conditions, and the right conditions for the mind are a gentle, loving openness and awareness to experience into whatever arises, under those conditions, we find that the mind is self-healing, self-correcting, self-actualizing, self-transcending, and self-awakening. The mind is innately holotropic, to use Stan Grof's words. It is oriented towards wholeness and healing. And many wise psychologists and sages have had the same recognition. Maslow called it self-actualization. Lots of different names. Hamid Almas, the great contemplative sage who founded the diamond work, calls it, was it the growth dynamic? So many different names, but we find we can trust the mind and we can trust ourselves. And beyond that, we find that we can trust the way things are. And coming back to Buddhism again, it's like we have faith, we trust in the Dharma, the way things are. And finally, we come to the recognition, which is embodied in a beautiful saying by the third Zen patriarch: the non-dual is one with a trusting mind.
Yeah, that's beautifully said, Roger. Yeah, thank you. Cool. That's sent me into a feeling of deep relaxation. Thanks for that. Yeah, so a couple of other things. So I was mentioning your book, Essential Spirituality, and I wanted to ask you where you stand on this idea of a world spirituality as a legitimate path that people can take. There's quite a lot of debate about it's a big conversation, and I hope we can pack it down into something quite tight. But I think Ken Wilber did a lot of great work around sort of integral spirituality as a kind of way of looking at that. And there's a chap called John Churchill, who you may know, who's sort of trying to create a planetary dharma, as he calls it. And that, although I've done practices in a lot of different traditions in my life, it sounds like you have too. And I don't know whether this is a personality type thing that, become to naturally omnivorous people, but I've never kind of given myself over to one particular tradition. And when I have conversations with people who have, they're always a little bit suspicious of the spiritual omnivore, and this kind of planetary dharma or a world spirituality seems a little bit lacking in depth, and not much weight behind it. That's the perception that quite a lot of people give, who are wedded to one particular way. And so where are you at with this? And I know you were involved with the Integral Institute, back in the day, and all of that, and working with Ken Wilburn. How do you feel about this topic of a world spirituality now?
Well, as you mentioned, Ralph, it's a rich topic, but to try to boil it down, first off, there's a distinction between a intellectual approach and a practice approach. And the intellectual
I'm thinking more. A lot of people have talked about the intellectual side of it, and I think probably my question relates more to the practical side of it.
Okay.
And that might be
Sure.
the hardest thing to address because, I don't know.
Yeah, I think there's some useful principles here. First off, we need to acknowledge that we are in an almost unique time in human history in which all the world's contemplative practices are available to us. And it's very easy to forget how rare this is, because this is the kind of air we breathe. But if you think across history, for most of human history, the vast majority of human history, if you tried practicing a tradition other than the accepted one, you're at grave risk of ending up on a funeral pyre or a crucifix. So it is very rare to not just have access to these traditions, that's rare enough, but to have the freedom to practice them. So one of the questions or cons of our time is, what is a skillful relationship to the plethora of practices we have? Because we not only have the world's spiritual traditions, we have the world's therapies, psychotherapies as well. And how does one make optimal use of this smorgasbord? So a key thing, first thing to acknowledge is, what's one's motivation? Is one's motivation in exploring a variety of practices curiosity, which is fine? Is it to avoid the discipline of going deeply and doing deep work with a particular practice? What's the motivation? Is it skillful motivation or is it unskillful motivation? So that is key. If, on the other hand, we focus exclusively on one practice, is it out of an ethnocentric belief that my way is the right way and I've found it and therefore wonderful me? Or is it, on the other hand, is it, no, I feel heartfelt, this calls me, this speaks to me, I really want to do this? Very different motives. So that's the first thing. Second thing is to acknowledge that it may be quite appropriate to adopt different attitudes at different stages of one's life and spiritual career. In the beginning, it may be quite appropriate to, and here I'm drawing on what Ramdas said, to do a kind of initial spiritual smorgasbord, to try things out, to see what really speaks to me, what works for me, what am I drawn to, what makes sense. But then will come a time where it's probable that just sampling things is being a dilettante and that one really needs to do some focused practice. And then it's appropriate to do that, to let go, dilly-dallying with multiple things and just dive in and really, really practice. And then, for me at least, I find that after doing a significant period of just, focusing in on one or two things, I find it maybe feel like I get a little stale. It'd be really good to try something new. And then maybe that's appropriate again. So that's one part of it. Another is, having the guidance and making use of wise teachers and peers. That's just crucial at any stage of practice. Having people one can turn to bounce things off and get guidance from. And yes, we talked about the traps that can go with idealizing teachers, but it's really valuable to have a teacher. And it's really important to look at the teacher with as deeply as one can. The Dalai Lama says, I can't remember his exact quote, but once it should take several years to really decide, am I really going to devote myself to this teacher? Or, and so there are wise ways of relating to teachers, but it's really valuable to have a community of practitioners and that one can turn to for consultation and advice about these things. So those are some of the things I think that come into play at this stage. And then a question also of integration. Can we recognize that no one practice does it all? That, even, take your pick of, no one therapy is going to handle all psychological issues, nor is it going to give you awakening. No one contemplative practice or meditation or spiritual discipline is going to do it all. The spiritual disciplines have no understanding of psychodynamics, of psychological defenses, of various personality types, etc. That's a modern Western psychotherapeutic innovation and contribution. So we can benefit from a complementary, skillful variety of practices. But again, what's the motivation?
And I suppose we're quite good at deceiving ourselves, and you can't just try and feel your own motivation, and that's why you need working with other people. They reflect back what your motivation. They can smell the bullshit, or affirm the genuineness of your motivation or whatever. It's you with working with therapists and people who they you know they're not going to just tell you what you want to hear. They're going to give you a kind of as objective a reflection as possible. Because depending on what type of person you are, you can end up surrounding yourself with yes people who just
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah, and you mentioned my book, Essential Spirituality: The Seven Central Practices, and I spent 3 years researching and writing that. And basically, my interest was, what are the wisest people who've ever landed on the planet say are the qualities of heart and mind that are essential for living fully, wisely, and well? And what are the practices that cultivate those qualities? And in looking across the world's traditions, I found 7 practices that the sages worldwide agreed on were essential for fully, coming to a full life and actualization of one's being and awakening. And the single recommendation that every tradition agreed on for every one of the 7 practices and qualities was, if you want to develop this capacity, hang out with people who have it.
Mm.
That was the biggest surprise in writing that book, how unanimous the agreement was. If you want to develop this particular quality, whether it's love or compassion or wisdom or clarity or generosity, hang out with people who have it. Consciousness is catchy.
That points to the kind of mysteriousness of learning. And I've got young children; they're 9 and 7, and they're learning from myself and my wife all the time, and in ways we're not trying to teach them. They just pick up who we are, the good things and the bad things, and yeah,
you can't not teach.
yeah. There's so just a couple of things to end up with, if that's okay. Um, so related to what you're saying about different practices working at different stages of your life, and knowing when to, I suppose, knowing when to cut loose or when to take up something new is an art in itself. Um, and one thing that happened. So, just wanted to share this with people who've listened, and anyone who's listened to my podcast for a while will know that I've been quite a fan of psychedelics for nearly 30 years. Well, actually 30 years now. But recently I had a mini sort of psychotic episode. I think it was cannabis induced. And I have just decided to take a break, maybe forever. I don't know at this point, but from all mind altering substances completely. And there was a time earlier in my life, in my 20s, where I was going quite gung ho with the old psychedelics, and had some weird things happen. The TV started talking to me and those kind of things, and I had friends who had gone schizophrenic, and I knew what that looked like and where that ended up, and I kind of took my foot off the gas for a bit. But as I felt that I was doing okay, I kind of took it back up, and was fine for a long time, and kind of got to a point where I thought, well, I'm all good with this, and I'm not going to be knocked off my my kind of steady stance. But then it happened, for me, with decades of experience and lots of enthusiasm for it. And yeah, it's been an interesting process for me, and I've had to, I suppose, grieve a bit the loss of those states of consciousness that I so enjoyed, and the adventure of all of that, and entering this new phase that's a bit unknown, of the next phase of my own journey with all of this stuff, that without those things. And you were listening. I listened to a conversation you had with Mark Foreman, who's a psychologist, psychotherapist, recently on your podcast, and he was saying that there's a chap called Roland Griffiths who's works in the world of psychedelics, and there's quite the kind of noisiest element of the psychedelic renaissance we're going through is psychedelics are amazing and they cure all of these things and they're really safe and blah blah blah. But what Roland Griffiths was saying was that there's going to come a point where all the horror is going to come out too, and loads of people are going to go mad, and that will be part of it, and we've got to come to terms with that and give some honest messaging on these things. So I was basically saying this as someone who has benefited a great deal from a wide variety of psychedelics in my life. I've really circled around the edges of madness a couple of times, and once recently in the last year that freaked me out, and basically I was just like, I don't want to go mad. I really don't want to go mad. So luckily I had the good I was in the right circumstances to just be able to completely, the next day, I'm done with that. Whereas earlier in my life, it took actually moving away from the social milieu I was in to get that break. And I think this is partly related to what you're saying about being in a community of people. Sometimes the community can keep you stuck in modes of living and practices which aren't actually good for you. And so say, for example, when in my 20s, when I was surrounded by people who were basically recommending just more is better and to just blow the top off this thing, and that kind of coincided with my overachieving heroic attitude, and it was a bad mix. So I just wanted to share that because that's something I probably could have done with hearing earlier in my life from someone who had actually the experience with psychedelics, not just someone who'd never ever tried them saying, oh no, drugs are bad.
And I think this is an important thing you're saying, Ralph, because this is an issue of our times. Yes, there is a psychedelic renaissance, and unfortunately, nothing seems to have been learned from the initial psychedelic euphoria of the 60s, when there was a similar hope and exaggerated hope and hype that was not realized. And there was the idea, well, if we just put psychedelics in the drinking water, everyone's drinking water, the world would be a lot better. Well, psychedelics are like a Pandora's box. They're very, very powerful medicines. And like Pandora's box, they can open a cavalcade of both highs and lows, heavens and hells, demons and saints. And it's really crucial to acknowledge both possibilities. And it's easy to fall into either extreme. There are the people who say psychedelics are just bad, full stop. Evil should be demonized, illegalized. And there are people who say, no, they're these wonderful, heal everything. And both are just extreme nonsense. They have enormous therapeutic potentials, and taken by the wrong person, they can be devastating. And I have treated a number of people on locked psychiatric units who took too many psychedelics or took them at the wrong time, who had a tendency towards schizophrenia or manic depressive disorder. And these can be very painful, extremely disruptive, and in some cases quite long lasting. So it's important to open to the complexity of this issue, the recognition that any medication, any drug has potential side effects. If someone tells you that a drug has no side effects, it means they either haven't found them yet, or it's a placebo, or the person's lying. That's it. And with psychedelics, these are some of the most potent psychoactive substances known to humankind, and they should be treated with enormous respect, and traditionally they were. I wrote a book, The World of Shamanism, which was looked at, did an overview of this tradition. And what we find is in that tradition, for thousands of years, these substances have been used ritually and sacramentally as a sacred sacrament, and to be treated in that way. And those cultures have a worldview to make sense of the experiences, a tradition to hold them, and a peer group to provide guidance. And that's what we need in this culture. And yet the psychedelics have erupted in a culture which has, at least in the 60s, had none, and now has very little understanding of altered states of consciousness, has no ritual, very little in the way of ritualized sacramental understanding of how to use them, and has a little bit now, and growing, community of people, wise people who appreciate both the potentials and the dangers. So
I wanted to just make one comment too, that in a tribal setting, they don't want people to go mad. A tribe is a closely related group of people, very close friends, people who've grown up their whole lives together. They don't want anyone in that tribe to lose their mind and go crazy. Whereas the responsibility is kind of a bit diffused in our society, where if people go crazy, you just send them off to some institution, and we forget about them, and they get medicated, or they just get medicated, and we just sort of keep them hidden, a bit like prisons and things, where we don't have that sense of community, where we really don't want that to happen to people. We've kind of gone past Dunbar's number or whatever, where of the 150 people that we can actually feel related to, and I feel that's a part of it.
Well, and you're right, Ralph. Yes, and I would add that people who become seriously mentally ill aren't just kept in institutions. They usually end up on the streets or in prisons, because our societies do not adequately provide mental health services to stabilize and maintain people in life. Usually nowadays, with the limited resources and time available, people are medicated and then they're discharged, and so many of them end up on the streets or in prisons. It's very tragic. Yet used wisely, as you're implying, with care and compassion and understanding, there really are enormous possibilities. I was particularly intrigued with the earliest psychedelic researchers, because if you think about it, someone like Stan Grof, who's supervised over 1,000 psychedelic sessions, has seen a wider array of human experiences than anyone else in history, anyone. And so these people, and there are only a few of them left now, are a living treasure. And so I was really fascinated to wanted to get these people together and get them dialoguing and interview them and find out what they'd learned. There was a mine of wisdom in these people, and we distilled it in a book, Higher Wisdom, What Eminent Elders Say About Psychedelics. But there's a treasure house of wisdom that can be obtained through these substances, but they must be treated with enormous respect, and ideally sacramentally.
That sounds like a great book. I look forward to reading that. So I've just got one more question for you, if that's okay. You got time for one more question?
One more.
Yeah. So people might be listening, look at this, and they're just saying, well, so we're obviously two white guys talking about this, one in America, one in England, privileged white guys. So my question is briefly, is there cultural differences and then differences for men and women that can be worth pointing out, or do you know what I mean? That you and I, we are obviously covering our narrow sliver of the human experience as two white men, and there's a much bigger world out there, and also, I mean, I've been responsible for this, but the conversation has had quite a lot to do with the Asian religions, for example. But there's a much wider world, and how do we, how would you bring that other wider picture of the world into this as a kind of closing?
Yeah, it's a great question, Ralph. And I think it's, again, one of the issues of our time. How do we open to the full array of cultures and practices and varieties of human beings and human experience? And ideally, all these practices are used in the service of relieving suffering and enhancing well-being. And that means using them to acknowledging our extraordinary good fortune and privilege, not just being white and male, but having access to education, to health systems, to resources, to these practices, to an enormous array of things. In fact, there's a wonderful meditation of just as when you sit down to meditate, just reflecting on all the things that have to come together, all the gifts and privileges and opportunities that have to come together before you can get to sit down and meditate. That's an endless list. So how do the question, the life koan for each of us doing these practices is, how do we use these practices to become more and effective instruments of help and healing and nourishment and support for others, particularly those less privileged than ourselves? That's the key question, because you can't do these practices for yourself alone, because you're not oneself alone to begin with, and because if you do them just for yourself alone, you're just enhancing egocentricity. So how do we do our practices in the service of relieving suffering, and particularly relieving the suffering of those less privileged? And how do we bring those perspectives to bear on our own lives? And how do we offer those multiple perspectives, different genders and cultures, etc.? And that's a great question, and I think it's one of the things it's a good koan to keep in mind. So thank you for bringing it up.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Roger, with your generosity with your time and sharing your wisdom, and such an interesting life you've led. And I really, it's been wonderful for me to have you. I mean, you never even met me before today, but I've known of your work for a long time, and you've kind of been a spiritual father or grandfather or something to me for a certain period of my life. So thank you so much for that, and I really hope other people can benefit from this and take on these lessons from you on the journey of practice.
Well, thank you for all the work you've done and for the gift you're giving me of having a chance of sharing these ideas, because these insights and ideas are to be shared.
And so for people who want to find out more about you, you have a website and podcast?
A website, drrogerwalsh.com, and a whole slew of things on there, all free. And yes, our podcast, which might be very interesting to your listeners because there's a lot of overlap, is called Deep Transformation, Self, Society, Spirit. And key books related to this, the ones you mentioned, Ralph: Essential Spirituality, The Seven Central Practices, The World of Shamanism is another, and the other one we mentioned, I think, was Higher Wisdom, about the original psychedelic pioneers and their experiences.
Yeah. I've also read Paths Beyond Ego.
Paths Beyond Ego. Bless you for having read it. Yes, that's a collection of essays or brief articles by real pioneers: Ram Dass, Houston Smith, Christina and Stan Groff, all the people we've all read, condensed into a collection of articles that are easy to easy to
I highly
get
recommend
through.
that to people. I made all the music that I use in my podcasts. If you'd like to hear more of my music, please visit SoundCloud and check out my profile, Ralph Cree.